"I'm not taking care of that old witch," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear as the pastor began his final prayer over my son's casket. And for a moment, I thought the ground beneath my feet might give way, not from grief, but from the quiet, deliberate cruelty wrapped in her voice, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't rage, but settles in like something cold and permanent. And I stood there in my black coat, my gloved hands folded neatly in front of me, staring at the polished wood of the casket that held what was left of the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run into my arms after school, the boy who once promised me, "Mom, I'll always take care of you." And I said nothing, not because I didn't understand what she meant, but because I understood it too well, because in that single sentence, whispered in a room full of people pretending to mourn, she had already decided who I was allowed to be in this new version of the family. And it wasn't a mother, it wasn't even a guest, it was a burden, something inconvenient to be managed or discarded. And I let my eyes drift, just slightly, enough to catch her reflection in the glass of the flower stand nearby. Lily in her perfectly tailored black dress, her head tilted just enough to look sorrowful to anyone watching, her hand resting lightly over her chest, as if her heart were the one that had been broken. And if I hadn't heard her myself, I might have believed it too. The performance was that convincing, the kind of performance that takes practice, that takes intention. And suddenly, the past few months began to rearrange themselves in my mind. Small moments that had once felt insignificant now clicking together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. The way my son's phone calls had become shorter, the way he had started saying, "We'll see," instead of course, Mom. The way Lily had begun answering questions that were never directed at her, smiling politely while doing it, as if she were helping, as if she were organizing something that had already belonged to her. And I remember thinking, standing there between rows of white lilies and neatly folded programs, that grief has a way of blurring things, of softening edges that should remain sharp. And maybe that's why I hadn't seen it sooner, or maybe I had seen it and simply chosen not to look too closely, because looking closely would have meant admitting that something inside my family had already started to rot long before we stood in that chapel. And the realization didn't come with tears, it didn't come with anger, it came with something far quieter, something steadier, like a door closing gently instead of slamming shut. And as the pastor's voice faded into the background, replaced by the soft rustling of people shifting in their seats, I straightened my gloves, lifted my chin just slightly, and allowed myself one small, controlled breath, because what Lily didn't know, what no one in that room seemed to understand, was that I had already heard something else, something far more important than her careless whisper 3 days ago, in a quiet office across town, where a man with silver hair and careful words had placed a folder in front of me and said, "Mrs. Hayes, there are some things you need to see." And I had listened, I had read, I had understood far more than anyone expected me to, and now, standing at my son's funeral, surrounded by sympathy that felt thin and rehearsed, I realized that this wasn't the moment I had lost everything. This was the moment they revealed who they truly were, and that, I thought as I kept my face still and my voice silent, was something I could work with. The chapel emptied slowly, like a tide pulling away from shore, leaving behind only the quiet remnants of what people believed they had just witnessed, and I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, my hands still folded in my lap, listening to the soft echo of footsteps and hushed voices fading into the hallway, because there is something revealing about how people behave when they think the moment is over, when they believe the performance no longer matters. And I watched as Lily stood near the front, accepting condolences with that same carefully measured expression, her head dipping at the right angles, her voice lowered just enough to suggest sorrow without ever fully breaking. And every now and then she would glance toward the exit, not toward the casket, not toward the photographs of my son placed beside the arrangement of white roses, but toward the door, as if she were waiting for something else entirely, something beyond grief. And I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my coat, allowing my movements to remain deliberate, controlled, because there is a kind of dignity in moving without urgency, especially when everyone else expects you to fall apart. And as I stepped into the aisle, a few people reached out to touch my arm, offering quiet words that blurred together into something indistinct, phrases like, "He was a good man," and "You raised him well." and I nodded politely, because there was no point in correcting them, no point in explaining that the man they remembered had already begun to fade long before this day, that something had shifted in him over the past year, subtle at first, then undeniable, like a shadow stretching longer with each passing evening, and I could still remember the last dinner we had shared at my house, the way he had checked his phone halfway through the meal, the way Lily had answered a question I had directed at him, laughing softly as she did, as if it were perfectly natural for her to speak in his place, and I had dismissed it then, told myself it was nothing, that couples develop their own rhythms, their own patterns of communication. But standing there now, watching her accept sympathy from people who had no idea who she truly was, I realized that those small moments had never been harmless. They had been rehearsals, quiet adjustments to a script I had not been given. And as I reached the back of the chapel, I noticed Mr. Collins standing near the side door, his posture straight, his expression reserved, the same expression he had worn 3 days ago when he had called me and asked if I could come by his office, saying only that there were matters regarding my son's estate that required immediate attention, and I remembered the way the light had filtered through the blinds in his office, casting narrow lines across the desk as he placed that folder in front of me, the thickness of it alone enough to suggest that whatever it contained was not simple, not routine, and he had not rushed me, had not filled the silence with unnecessary explanations, instead allowing me to open it myself, to see the documents in my own time, and I could still feel the weight of that moment, the way my fingers had hesitated just slightly before turning the first page. Because there is a difference between suspecting something is wrong and seeing proof laid out in careful, undeniable detail, and when I looked up at him after reading those pages, he had met my gaze steadily and said, "Your son made some decisions in the last 6 months that you were not informed about." And I had nodded, not because I understood everything immediately, but because I understood enough to know that the life I thought I had been part of was no longer the one that existed on paper, and now, as I approached him in the quiet after the service, he inclined his head slightly in greeting, not offering condolences, not repeating the empty phrases I had heard all morning, but instead asking in a low, measured voice, "Are you ready to proceed when the time comes?" And I held his gaze for a moment, feeling the last fragile pieces of hesitation settle into something firmer, something clearer, and I gave a small nod, because readiness is not something that arrives all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize there is nothing left to wait for. And as I turned away from him, I caught sight of Lily again, standing just outside the chapel doors now, her expression already shifting, the sorrow fading from her features the moment she believed no one important was watching, replaced by something sharper, something more calculating. And she did not see me as I paused a few steps behind her, did not notice the way I observed the change in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed as if a burden had been lifted, and I wondered, not for the first time, what she believed would happen next, whether she thought the story had already ended, whether she imagined that with my son gone, the rest of us would simply fall into the roles she had quietly arranged for us. And I said nothing, because silence, I had learned, is often mistaken for weakness, when in truth it is simply the space where decisions are made. And as the afternoon light stretched across the parking lot and the last of the guests began to leave, I stepped forward, my footsteps soft against the pavement, and for the first time since the morning began, I allowed myself a single, private thought, clear and steady, that whatever came next would not unfold the way she expected. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Even though the route had not changed in over 20 years, the same turns, the same quiet streets lined with maple trees just beginning to lose their leaves, but everything looked different now, as if the world had shifted slightly out of place. And when I pulled into the driveway of the house I had lived in for more than 3 decades, I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the ticking sound as it cooled, because there is a strange kind of silence that follows a day like that, not peaceful, not comforting, but hollow, like something important has been removed and nothing has filled the space yet. And I finally stepped out, walking up the familiar path to the front door, noticing small things I had overlooked for years, the slight crack in the 3rd step, the way the brass handle had dulled over time, details that once felt permanent now seemed fragile, temporary. And when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, The house greeted me with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge what had changed, and I set my purse down on the entry table, removing my gloves slowly, placing them beside it with care, because routine has a way of anchoring you when everything else feels uncertain, and I moved through the living room, my eyes catching on the photographs arranged along the mantel, each one a frozen moment from a life that no longer existed in the way I remembered it. My son at 10 years old holding up a baseball glove that was too big for his hand, my son at 18 standing beside his first car, smiling in a way that was open and unguarded, and then later photographs, ones that included Lily, where his smile was still there, but different somehow, more measured, as if he were aware of being watched, and I reached out, adjusting one of the frames that had tilted slightly, though I could not say why it bothered me, only that it did, and I continued into the kitchen, where the clock on the wall marked time with a steady, indifferent rhythm, each second passing without regard for what had been lost, and I poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, letting the quiet settle around me, because it was here, in this ordinary space, that the memory of Mr. Collins's office returned with a clarity that demanded attention. The way he had slid a second document across the desk after I finished reading the first, his voice calm, almost too calm, as he explained that my son had transferred certain assets into a joint account, an account that I had never been told about, and that the primary co-holder of that account was Lily, and I had not reacted then, not outwardly, because reacting would have required me to accept the full weight of what that meant. And instead I had asked questions, precise, careful questions, the kind that reveal more than they conceal, and he had answered each one without hesitation, confirming that the changes had been made legally, recently, and with a level of intention that could not be dismissed as oversight. And now, standing in my kitchen, I set the glass down and let my fingers rest against the cool surface of the counter, because understanding something in theory is very different from feeling it settle into place inside you. And I could see it now, not just the financial decisions, but the pattern behind them, the gradual shift of control, the quiet redirection of authority, the way my role had been reduced without confrontation, without explanation, until I was no longer part of the decisions that shaped the very foundation of the life I thought I still belonged to. And I thought about the way Lily had stood outside the chapel earlier, the way her expression had changed the moment she believed no one was watching, and I realized that whatever she expected to happen next, it did not include resistance, it did not include questions, it certainly did not include consequences, and I pushed myself away from the counter, moving toward the hallway where the door to my son's old room stood slightly ajar, and for a moment I hesitated, my hand resting lightly against the frame, because there are spaces that hold more than just objects, they hold versions of people, versions of yourself. And stepping into them means facing the distance between what was and what is. And when I finally opened the door, the room looked almost unchanged. The same furniture, the same arrangement, as if time had paused there while everything else moved forward. And I took a slow breath, letting my eyes adjust, because somewhere between grief and clarity, something inside me had shifted, something that was no longer willing to accept the version of events that had been presented to me. And as I stood there in the quiet, I understood that what I had lost was not just my son, but the illusion that the people around me had been acting in good faith. And once that illusion is gone, there is no returning to the way things were, only a choice about what comes next. And I made that choice without speaking it aloud, without announcing it to anyone, because some decisions are stronger when they are kept to yourself. And as I turned off the hallway light and closed the door behind me, I knew with a certainty that felt almost calm that I would not be stepping into the role they had quietly prepared for me. Not now. Not ever. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No sudden clarity, no dramatic shift, just the soft gray light filtering through the curtains and the quiet awareness that everything I had understood the night before was still true. And I moved through my routine with the same steady pace, making coffee, placing a single cup on the table, sitting down in the chair where I had sat for years. But now there was a difference, not in what I did, but in how I saw it. Because once you recognize a pattern, you cannot unsee it. And as I lifted the cup to my lips, I found myself replaying small conversations, small gestures, things that had once seemed harmless, like the time Lily had insisted on handling all the household bills after my son got busy with work, saying it would make things easier for everyone, or the way she had gently corrected me in front of others, framing it as helpful, always polite, always smiling, and I had accepted it then, thinking it was just her way of contributing, her way of fitting into the family. But now those moments felt different, not isolated, but connected, part of something larger that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, and I set the cup down, letting my fingers rest against the table as I considered what came next, because understanding a situation is only the first step. The more important question is what you choose to do with that understanding, and I thought about Mr. Collins, about the documents still sitting in that folder, about the details I had only begun to absorb, and I knew that ignoring them was no longer an option. Not if I wanted to remain in control of my own life. And control, I realized, is often lost not in a single moment, but in a series of small decisions to let things slide, to avoid conflict, to trust that others have your best interests at heart. And I had done that, for years, because it felt easier, because it felt kinder, but kindness without boundaries is simply an invitation, and I had extended that invitation without realizing who was accepting it. And I stood up, carrying my empty cup to the sink, rinsing it carefully before setting it aside, because there is a certain clarity that comes with deciding to act, even if the action itself has not yet taken shape. And I walked to the living room, picking up my phone from the side table, my thumb hovering over the screen for a brief moment before I scrolled to Mr. Collins's number. And when he answered, his voice was as steady as it had been in his office, as if he had been expecting this call, and I spoke without hesitation, telling him I wanted to review everything again, every document, every detail, because there would be no assumptions this time, no gaps in my understanding, and he agreed without question, suggesting we meet that afternoon. And when the call ended, I placed the phone back down, feeling a quiet sense of alignment settle into place. Because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done, it was about choosing how to respond. And as I moved toward the front window, looking out at the street where life continued as it always had, neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing by without pause, I realized that the world does not stop for your realizations. It does not wait for you to catch up. And if you do not step forward, you are left behind in a version of events that no longer serves you. And I had no intention of remaining there, not when I could already see the outlines of something else, something more deliberate. And I allowed myself one final thought before turning away from the window, a simple acknowledgement that the role they had quietly assigned to me was one I had never agreed to. And now that I had seen it clearly, there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Mr. Collins's office felt different the second time I walked in, not because anything had changed, the same polished desk, the same neatly arranged files, the same quiet hum of the air conditioning filling the space, but because I had changed, because I was no longer sitting there as someone trying to understand what had happened. I was there to confirm it, to see it clearly and completely. And he seemed to recognize that without me having to say it, offering a brief nod as I took my seat. Across from him, the folder already placed in front of me as if it had been waiting, and I opened it again, this time with steadier hands, turning each page slowly, deliberately, because details matter when you are deciding what to do next, and he began to walk me through it, not in broad terms, but in specifics, dates, amounts, signatures, each piece of information forming a clearer picture than the one I had allowed myself to see before. And what stood out was not just the existence of the account, but the pattern of activity, the timing of transfers, the way certain decisions had been made in quick succession, as if someone had been working against a clock I had not known existed. And I listened without interrupting, because there is power in letting the full story unfold before reacting to it. And when he finished, he leaned back slightly, giving me space to process, but I did not need much time, not anymore, because what had once felt like confusion now felt like confirmation. And I asked him a question, a simple one, about what control remained, what authority had not been signed away, and he answered with the same measured tone, explaining that while certain assets had been moved, others had not, that there were still legal boundaries that could not be crossed without my consent, that there were still decisions that required my signature. And I nodded, because that was all I needed to hear, not reassurance, not sympathy, just clarity. And as I closed the folder, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not even sadness, but but a kind of quiet resolve, the kind that does not demand attention but does not fade either. And I stood, thanking him for his time, arranging to have copies of everything sent to me, because there would be no relying on memory, no leaving anything to chance. And when I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was brighter than I expected, the light reflecting off the windshields of parked cars, the world continuing as it always does, indifferent to the decisions being made within it. And I walked to my car with the same steady pace I had carried through the past few days, because there is no need to rush when you know exactly where you are going. And as I drove home, I allowed myself to consider Lily, not with emotion, but with precision, thinking about the way she had positioned herself, the way she had spoken at the service, the confidence behind her words, the assumption that nothing would challenge her. And I realized that confidence does not come from nowhere. It comes from believing you have accounted for every variable, every possible response. And perhaps she had. Perhaps she had considered what I might do if I discovered the truth. But what she had not considered, what she could not have accounted for, was what I would choose to do once I understood it completely. And that difference, I thought as I turned onto my street, was where everything would begin to shift. And when I pulled into my driveway, I did not sit in the car. This time, I stepped out immediately, walking toward the house with a sense of purpose that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely my own. Because for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting to someone else's decisions. I was preparing to make my own. And inside, as I placed the folder carefully on the table, I knew that whatever came next would not be rushed, it would not be loud, but it would be deliberate. And once it began, it would not be something that could be easily undone. The house was quiet again that evening, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt focused, as if every object, every shadow, every small detail had settled into its proper place. And I moved through the rooms with a different awareness, not looking for comfort, but for clarity, because clarity has a way of sharpening everything around you. And I paused at the dining table where the folder still rested exactly where I had placed it, unopened since I returned, not out of avoidance, but because I no longer needed to read it again to understand what it meant. And instead I pulled out a chair and sat down, folding my hands in front of me the same way I had at the service, the same way I had in Mr. Collins's office, because posture matters, even when you are alone, even when no one is watching. And I allowed myself to think through the sequence of events, not emotionally, but logically, step by step, the transfers, the timing, the silence, the assumptions that had been made about me. And what became clear was not just what had been taken, but what had been expected of me in response, that I would remain quiet, that I would accept what was presented without question, that I would slowly fade into the background of a life that had already begun to exclude me. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering that expectation, turning it over in my mind as if examining something fragile, because expectations, when left unchallenged, become reality. And I had allowed that to happen once, but I would not allow it again. And I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in quite some time, not because the connection had been lost, but because it had simply not been necessary until now. And when the call connected, the voice on the other end was warm, familiar, and steady, and I spoke calmly, explaining only what was required, that I needed certain records reviewed, that I needed a second set of eyes, someone who understood the nuances that are often overlooked. And there was no hesitation in the response, only a quiet agreement, a confirmation that I was not navigating this alone. And when the call ended, I set the phone down carefully, because this was not about confrontation, not yet. This was about preparation, about ensuring that every step I took would be grounded in something solid, something undeniable. And I stood, walking to the window once more, watching as the last light of the day faded across the street, the outlines of houses softening as evening settled in. And I thought about Lily again, about the certainty in her voice, the way she had spoken as if the future had already been decided, as if my place in it had already been reduced to something small and manageable. And I allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition, because certainty can be dangerous when it is based on incomplete information. And she had been very certain, very confident, but she had not been thorough. She had not considered every possibility. And that was where her mistake began. And as I turned away from the window, reaching for the folder once more, I knew that what I was Building now was not impulsive, not reactive, but deliberate. Each decision placed carefully on top of the last, until there would be no room left for doubt. And when the moment came, it would not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. It would only require the truth, presented clearly, at exactly the right time. And until then, I would wait, I would observe, and I would prepare. The following day unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because I approached each moment with intention rather than habit. And there is a difference between moving through your life and directing it, a difference that becomes clear only when you stop allowing others to shape the path for you. And I began with something simple, reviewing the documents once more, not to discover anything new, but to commit every detail to memory, the dates, the signatures, the specific language used in each clause, because words, I had learned, can be arranged to conceal as easily as they reveal, and I would not allow anything to remain unclear. And as I sat at the table, a pen in my hand, making small notes in the margins, I felt a steady sense of control settle in, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just present, like a quiet current beneath the surface. And when I finished, I closed the folder carefully and placed it aside, because preparation is not about repetition, it is about readiness. And I knew I was getting closer to that point. And later that afternoon, my phone rang, Lily's name appearing on the screen, and for a moment I let it ring, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because answering immediately would have been expected, and I was no longer interested in meeting expectations that had been built without my consent. And when I finally answered, my voice was calm, measured, the same tone I had used for years, the same tone she would recognize as cooperative, and she spoke with a softness that might have sounded genuine to someone who did not know her well, asking how I was holding up, mentioning the service, the arrangements, the small details that create the illusion of care, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to finish, because people often reveal more when they believe they are in control of the conversation. And when she paused, I responded simply, thanking her, acknowledging her effort, offering nothing more, because there was no need to challenge her. Not yet, and I could almost hear the subtle shift in her tone, the brief uncertainty that followed, as if she had expected something else, perhaps emotion, perhaps dependence, something she could use to define her role, moving forward. And when that did not come, she adjusted quickly, suggesting we meet in a few days to discuss things, her words carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, but weighted underneath, and I agreed without hesitation, because the opportunity had presented itself sooner than I anticipated. And as the call ended, I placed the phone down and allowed myself a moment to consider what had just happened, not the conversation itself, but what it represented, because this was the beginning of the next phase, the point where preparation meets action. And I stood, walking to the window once more, watching the quiet movement of the neighborhood, people going about their routines, unaware of the quiet shifts happening behind closed doors. And I realized that the meeting she had proposed was not something to avoid. It was something to use, a setting where assumptions could be tested, where control could be redefined, and I allowed myself to plan, not in broad strokes, but in specifics. What would be said, what would be withheld, what would be revealed, and when, because timing, I had come to understand, is just as important as truth. And as the afternoon light began to fade, I felt a steady clarity settle over me. The kind that does not require reassurance, because it is built on understanding. And as I turned away from the window, I knew that when I sat across from her again, it would not be as the person she believed me to be. It would be as someone who had already seen the entire picture and who had chosen exactly how to respond to it. The meeting was set for late afternoon, at a small cafe just a few blocks from where Lily lived, a place she had chosen herself, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because time, I had learned, reveals more than words ever could, and I wanted to see how she would enter, how she would carry herself when she believed she was stepping into a situation she controlled. And I selected a table near the window, where the light fell evenly across the surface, leaving no shadows to hide behind. And I sat with my hands folded loosely in front of me, my posture relaxed but deliberate, observing the quiet rhythm of the room, the soft clink of cups, the low murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with what was about to unfold. And when she finally appeared, I noticed it immediately, the slight hesitation in her step as she scanned the room, the quick adjustment of her expression before she spotted me, the practiced smile returning as if it had never left, and she approached with that same measured grace, leaning in to offer a brief, polite embrace that lingered just long enough to appear sincere. And when she pulled back, her eyes searched my face, not for comfort, but for information, for signs that would confirm whatever version of me she had constructed in her mind. And I gave her none, only a calm, steady gaze that revealed nothing beyond what I chose to show. And we sat down, the server arriving to take our orders, Lily choosing something light, something that suggested control, composure, while I simply asked for coffee, because simplicity leaves less room for distraction. And once we were alone again, she began to speak, her voice soft, carefully modulated, expressing concern, mentioning the practical matters that follow loss, the house, the accounts, the next steps, each phrase wrapped in language that sounded collaborative but carried an underlying assumption. And I listened, allowing her to move through her prepared thoughts without interruption. Because there is a moment in every conversation where the structure reveals itself, where intention becomes visible beneath the surface. And when she finally paused, offering me space to respond, I did not rush to fill it. I let the silence settle, watching the slight shift in her posture as she adjusted to the absence of immediate feedback. And then I spoke, my voice even, unhurried, acknowledging what she had said without agreeing to it, repeating certain phrases back to her in a way that clarified their meaning, because clarity has a way of removing the comfort of ambiguity. And I saw it then, the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the moment where confidence meets resistance and does not immediately know how to proceed. And she recovered quickly. Of course she did, offering a gentle explanation, reframing her words. But the shift had already occurred, subtle but undeniable. And I reached into my bag, not with urgency, not with drama, but with intention, and I placed a single document on the table between us, not the entire folder, not everything I knew, just enough to change the direction of the conversation. And I watched as her gaze dropped to the paper, her expression remaining composed for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before something tightened, almost imperceptibly, at the corner of her mouth. And I said nothing, because the truth, when presented at the right moment, does not require explanation. It simply exists. And as she looked back up at me, searching for something in my expression, I met her gaze steadily, allowing her to understand without being told that this conversation was no longer unfolding according to her expectations, that whatever role she had assigned to me had already begun to dissolve. And in that quiet space between us, filled not with raised voices, but with something far more controlled, I realized that the balance had shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to change what would come next, and that was all I needed for now. For a moment, neither of us moved, the document resting quietly between us as if it carried no weight at all. But I could see the shift in her, not in anything obvious, not in a dramatic reaction, but in the way her fingers paused against the edge of the table, in the slight tightening of her posture as she realized that whatever she had expected from this meeting was no longer aligned with what was actually happening. And she reached for the paper slowly, carefully, as if speed might reveal something she was not ready to show, her eyes scanning the lines with a precision that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at, even if she was not yet ready to acknowledge it out loud. And when she finished, she placed it back down with the same measured control she had used to pick it up, lifting her gaze to meet mine, her expression composed but no longer effortless. And she spoke, her voice still soft but carrying a different edge now, asking where I had found it, how much I knew. Questions that were framed as curiosity but carried the unmistakable weight of concern. And I answered simply, without embellishment, telling her that I had taken the time to understand what had been done, that I had reviewed everything carefully, because there is no need to reveal more than necessary when the truth is already doing the work for you. And I watched as she processed that, her mind moving quickly behind the calm exterior, recalibrating, adjusting, searching for a new position from which to regain control. And she attempted it. Of course she did, offering explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, talking about practicality, about helping my son manage his responsibilities, about decisions made under pressure, each sentence carefully constructed to soften the implications, to redirect the narrative into something more acceptable, and I listened without interruption, allowing her to build that version of events fully, because it is important to see the shape of a story before you decide whether to accept it. And when she finished, I did not challenge her directly. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply asked a question, a single, clear question about timing, about why those decisions had been made when they were. And the effect was immediate, subtle, but undeniable, because timing is not something that can be easily reframed. It either aligns or it does not. And for the first time since we sat down, she hesitated, not for long, just a brief pause, but enough to confirm what I already understood. And in that pause, the balance shifted further, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from anyone around us, but in a quiet, decisive way that changed the direction of everything that followed. And I leaned back slightly, giving her space, not out of deference, but because space has a way of revealing what pressure tries to hide. And she filled it quickly, offering another explanation, another layer. But the certainty was no longer there. The confidence that had carried her through the beginning of the conversation had begun to thin. And I realized then that this was not about forcing an admission. It was not about confrontation. It was about establishing reality, about making it clear that I was no longer operating under assumptions, that I was no longer willing to accept incomplete information as truth. And I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip, allowing the moment to settle, because there is strength in not rushing to the next point, in letting the current one fully land. And when I set the cup down, I spoke again, calmly, deliberately, explaining that there would be a formal review of everything, that nothing further would be decided without my direct involvement, that all future discussions would include the appropriate legal oversight. And I did not frame it as a threat. I did not need to. It was simply a statement of fact, a boundary drawn clearly and without apology. And she nodded, because there was little else she could do in that moment, her options narrowing in ways she had not anticipated. And as we sat there, the conversation moving into quieter, more cautious territory, I understood that this was not the end of anything, not yet, but it was the end of one version of the story. The version where I remained unaware, where I remained passive, where decisions were made around me rather than with me. And as we stood to leave, exchanging polite words that carried none of the meaning they once might have, I saw it again, that brief flicker in her eyes, not fear exactly, but recognition, the understanding that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. And as I walked out into the fading light of the afternoon, the air cool and steady against my face, I felt no need to look back, because what mattered was already in motion, not loud, not visible to anyone else, but certain. And for the first time since everything began, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided for me. It would be decided by me.